kannst du es hören. Der Wind. Es klingt wie Fegen.
The German army was the most powerful military force in history. They had the Panzer tanks. They had the Messerschmitt fighters. They had conquered Europe in months. But on the frozen plains of Russia, the invincible Wehrmacht soldiers were terrified of something they couldn't see. They were terrified of a sound. They attacked at night. They struck without warning. There was no roar of engines, just a soft swish, like a broomstick sweeping the sky, followed by the blast of bombs. The Germans called them the Nachthexen, the night witches. Rumors spread through the German ranks. They said these pilots were given special pills to see in the dark like cats. They said they were criminals, forced to fly as punishment. They were wrong. They weren't criminals, and they weren't super soldiers. They were teenagers, former students, factory workers, teachers. They were the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the only all-female combat unit in World War II, and they were about to teach the Nazis a lesson in fear. (1941) Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's war machine was tearing the Soviet Union apart. The Red Army was collapsing. Millions of men were dead or captured. The country was desperate. In Moscow, thousands of women flooded the recruitment offices. They wanted to fight. They were told, "Go home. Help the wounded. War is for men." But one woman wouldn't take no for an answer. Marina Roskova. In America, they had Amelia Earhart. In Russia, they had Marina Roskova. She was a celebrity, a record-breaking navigator. She received fan mail by the truckload. She used her personal connection to Joseph Stalin to propose something radical. 3 regiments of female pilots. Not transport, not medical, combat. Stalin agreed. Roskova put out the call. Within days, 2,000 women applied. They were young. Most were between 17 and 26. When they arrived for training at Engels Aviation School, the military didn't know what to do with them. There were no women's uniforms. They were given men's boots, size 42 or 43. They had to stuff the toes with newspaper just to walk without tripping. The male instructors laughed at them. They called them a doll's division. But the laughter didn't last long. Roskova told them, "You have to learn in a few months what the men learn in 2 years." They studied 14 hours a day. They learned to be pilots, navigators, mechanics, and armorers. And then they were introduced to their war machines. The girls looked at the planes on the runway, and their hearts sank. This is the Polikarpov Po-2. It was a crop duster, a training plane designed in 1928. It was made of plywood and canvas, essentially fabric stretched over a wooden frame. It had an open cockpit. No glass to protect you from the wind or bullets. It had no radio. The pilots communicated by yelling or waving their hands. It had no armor. A single bullet could rip through the pilot. And worst of all, it was highly flammable. The canvas was coated in a substance called dope to make it waterproof, but dope is also incredibly flammable. If a tracer bullet hit a Po-2, it didn't just crash, it burned like a paper torch. And here is the most terrifying detail. Until 1944, the night witches were not given parachutes. Why? Because the planes were so underpowered that the weight of a parachute, about 25 pounds, was considered too heavy. They needed that weight for bombs. Also, the commanders believed parachutes would encourage pilots to bail out too early. So every time these women took off, they knew. If the plane catches fire, there is no escape. You burn with it. The Po-2 had a top speed of 90 miles per hour. That's slower than a modern highway speed limit. Against the German Messerschmitts, which could fly at 400 miles per hour, the Po-2 should have been easy prey. But, ironically, the plane was too bad to shoot down. This is a lesson in aerodynamics. The stall speed of a German fighter, the slowest it can fly before falling out of the sky, was about 100 miles per hour. The top speed of the Po-2 was 90. The German pilots couldn't fly slow enough to aim. If they tried to match the Witch's speed, they would stall and crash. The Witches used this. They flew dangerously low, hugging the treetops, weaving through ravines where the fast German fighters couldn't follow. They turned their weakness into their greatest strength. June 1942. The 588th Regiment arrives at the front. Their mission? Harassment bombing. The goal wasn't just to destroy targets. It was to destroy sleep, to drive the German soldiers insane. But how do you sneak up on an enemy when your engine sounds like a lawnmower? They developed a tactic that became their signature. The pilots would climb to a certain altitude, approach the target, and then kill the engine. They would glide. Silent. Invisible. The only sound was the wind whistling through the canvas wings' wires. To the Germans below, that soft whistling sound was the sound of death. It sounded like a witch's broomstick cutting through the air. Hence, the Night Witches. They would glide over the target, pull the release lever, drop the bombs, and restart the engine just feet before crashing into the trees to escape. It was suicidal. It required nerves of steel. And they didn't just do it once a night. Because the Po-2 could only carry 2 bombs at a time, they had to return to base, reload, and go back. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most famous witches, once flew 18 missions in a single night. Imagine that. Taking off, facing death, landing, and doing it again, 17 more times, before the sun came up. The Germans weren't the only enemy. The Russian winter was just as deadly. The Po-2 had an open cockpit. There was no heater, no glass canopy. At night, temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Flying at 100 miles per hour, the wind chill was enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. The pilots developed frostbite on their faces and feet. They touched the frozen metal of the plane and their skin would peel off. During the flights, they couldn't wear heavy gloves because they needed to feel the stick, so their hands froze into claws. When they landed, the ground crews often had to physically lift the women out of the cockpits because their legs were too frozen to move. But the cold did something even worse. It iced up the engines. There are reports of mechanics, also women, who had to do the unthinkable. During a flight, if the engine jammed with ice, a mechanic would sometimes climb out of the cockpit, crawl along the slippery wing mid-air, and knock the ice off the propeller manually, without a parachute, in the dark, while being shot at. It defies the laws of survival, but they did it. Despite the hell they lived in, they held on to their humanity. They used navigational pencils as lipstick. They sewed flowers onto their flight suits. They danced between sorties. Nadezhda Popova, the legendary commander, said, "We bombed, we killed, we froze, but we were still girls. We wanted to live." But the Germans were adapting. They were tired of being humiliated by girls. The Germans developed a counter-tactic specifically for the witches. They called it the circus. They arranged flak guns and searchlights in concentric circles around key targets. They would wait for the hum of the Po-2 engines. Then they would switch on dozens of blinding searchlights at once. For a pilot flying in total darkness, the light was blinding. It was like staring into the sun. Trapped in the beams, the slow wooden PO-2 was a sitting duck. One night, Nadezhda Popova watched as her friends were caught in the circus. She saw the tracer bullets hit the plane ahead of her. The dope-coated canvas ignited instantly. Popova later recalled, "It was like a falling cross, a burning cross in the sky." She watched the plane spiral down. She knew the pilot and navigator inside. She knew they had no parachutes. She could see them burning alive in the cockpit as they fell. She watched them hit the ground, and then she turned her plane, flew through the wall of fire, dropped her bombs, and flew home. She cried all the way back. Then she reloaded and went out again. That night, the regiment lost 4 planes, 8 women. They didn't have time to mourn. They adopted a new rule. You are not allowed to cry until the war is over. The tide of the war turned. The Red Army pushed the Germans back, mile by bloody mile. The Night Witches moved with the front lines. They flew over the Crimea, over Poland, and finally, over Germany itself. By 1945, they were flying over Berlin. Imagine the irony. The Nazis, who claimed to be the master race, who believed women were only good for cooking and cleaning, were now cowering in their bunkers. And above them, raining fire on their heads, were the very women they mocked, flying crop dusters made of plywood. In total, the 588th Regiment flew over 30,000 missions. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. They produced 23 Heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the country. They had done the impossible. But the end of the story is bittersweet. When the war ended, a massive victory parade was held in Moscow. The Night Witches prepared their uniforms. They were ready to march. They were ready to be celebrated. But the order came down. The 588th will not participate. Why? Because their planes were too slow to keep up with the formation? Because their wooden planes looked too primitive for Soviet propaganda? And perhaps because they were women. They were told the war was over. Their duty was done. It was time to go home and be mothers. The regiment was disbanded. The planes were scrapped. For decades, their story was largely forgotten by the West, but they never forgot each other. Every year on May 2nd, the survivors met at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. They wore their medals. They remembered the burning crosses in the sky. Nadezhda Popova lived to be 91. Before she died, she said, "I sometimes look up at the dark sky, and I close my eyes, and I can still hear the wind in the wires. I am still flying." The Nazis called them witches. History calls them heroes. But to each other, they were just sisters who reached for the sky when the world was burning. If this story inspired you, please hit the like button and tell me in the comments, which other unsung heroes of World War II should we cover next? Thanks for watching.